Good morning and welcome. I'm not hearing some enthusiasm, but that's okay. It's still early. So it's a great morning. It's an exciting conversation and really happy to be here. Um, Today we're about to discuss the third way. I have read the book. I think there'll be some kind of giveaway for the book. I see a lot of books here, so we'll get to that. But I want to open my remarks with a quote. The best way to predict the future is to invent it. This is a quote that I have picked from Rahul Matthan's book, and I think it talks well about our discussions here on digital public infrastructure. DPIs, as we've come to know them, is an innovation that has offered many people and is also revolutionizing as our society. When you read this book, you will meet a lady who is called Rajani. We follow Rajani's life and how DPI has been able to revolutionize her life. This is a story that is not just being written here in India, but I think the story of digital transformation also has many stories like that. In my country, Kenya, we don't have Rajani Rahul. We have a lady called Wanjiku. And her experiences may mirror what we've seen with Rajani in the book. Digital transformation making ordinary women. Rajani is a lady who sells in the market her vegetables. Someone you just pass and you never probably know her. But because of the power of digital infrastructure, she's now able to borrow, make money, sell her product. Her life is becoming a powerful digital story. So, what are we here to discuss? The risks and what India has done to avert those risks within the DPI and data governance. You see, within every digital transformation story, there's also risks. But today we are here to talk about how DPI, the India story, has a third way. And I would like us to start there by understanding what is the third way. I'm sure you're wondering, what is the third way? So I have the author himself. I have Nandan, who will also be speaking, and then we have Tino. So I'll ask each panelist to begin their comments, opening comments. Rahul, of course, will give us an overview of the book, and then we'll go into opening session. Then after that, we'll do a moderated question and answer, and then I'll come to you for questions and answer for questions. So get ready, write them down, and we'll ask these questions. So over to you, Rahul.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Carnegie, for organizing this discussion. I was told yesterday that a good author must have a 1-minute pitch for his book. I'm clearly not a good author because this book, I struggle to explain it in that much of a concise form. I'm going to try. The idea behind the third way came out of perhaps conversations that started last year this time at GTS, where a lot of people were talking about DPI, but the same questions around governance kept coming about. And I felt that as much as we had done to promote the idea of DPI, the technology that allows us to make this transformation, not much was being said about the governance. And then I struggled to find a frame within which to explain this. And that's where the idea of the third way came about. Because if you think about data governance started out in the US, where the internet sort of started. And the US approach to governing the internet was very much, let's keep our hands off this thing so that it can develop on its own. Because if we come in and try and regulate it, we're going to stifle it. And so the US approach was very much a laissez-faire approach in the early days. The US approach was very much allow the companies to come up with the data governance for these systems that they're rolling out. And of course, that worked in the beginning. It's impossible to say that wasn't useful because that is the reason why the internet and data technologies have proliferated to the point where it is now just part of everything that we do. But over time, some of the challenges with that started to manifest themselves. And that's when Europe came up with a more regulatory heavy approach. Europe said that we can't leave this to the companies to regulate. We must actually come up with rules of the road. And we must tell companies that these are the things they have to comply with in order to continue to participate in this ecosystem. And so that, in my mind, was the second way of doing data governance, which is prescribe the guardrails through laws and regulations and require ecosystem participants to actually comply with those laws and regulations. Now, the problem with this also is that, one, laws tend to lag technology by a year, sometimes by a decade. And by the time you enact new laws to regulate the new direction in which technology has moved, you already have to account for a new direction in which technology has moved from there. And if we can just see what happened with generative AI in just the last 12 months, you can see how rapidly that pace of change is accelerating. And so using laws alone to regulate technology, we're also now coming up with obstacles. And so as I looked at India's digital public infrastructure, I saw within the digital public infrastructure, embedded directly in the architecture, legal principles that were actually prescribed and described in the regulations that Europe had drafted. And I'm a privacy lawyer, so I took a very close lens on the privacy aspects, and in particular, in our data empowerment and protection architecture, which is in the book, I say, there are three elements: is access, engagement, and empowerment. This is the empowerment layer of the digital public infrastructure story. And so I was struck by the idea that perhaps we could take rules and regulations that we all agree are necessary and perhaps embed them into digital architectures that are being adopted with greater intensity around the world. And perhaps that would be a more efficient way to do what we all want, which is regulate the sphere, but do it at the speed of innovation. And so the idea that occurred to me was this third way would be to articulate a digital infrastructure on which regulators can regulate and innovators can innovate, and not keep them separate, have the same platform on which both could interact. Now, everything that I've said is perhaps an exaggeration. I don't think the world is black and white in this manner. I don't think the US is completely laissez-faire. I don't think European regulation doesn't encourage innovation. I'm saying this to make a point, stating the extremes, to say that there could perhaps be another way to think about this. I must also hasten to add that this is not my idea. The idea of code as law was written by someone who was the first author I read on the topic, Lawrence Lessig, at the dawn of the internet, 25 years ago, wrote a book called Code and the Other Laws of Cyberspace. Essentially, he said that as we look to the internet as a new space, we must recognize that the protocols that we write will, in that space, be as effective as laws in the non-digital space. It's just that India took that idea and embedded it into the digital public infrastructure. And so to bring this whole thing round full circle, the conversations we started last year around DPI and the technology and all the benefits that it provides threw up a lot of questions. What about the governance? What about the harms? Jane, as you said, what about the risks? And I posit that, of course, it's not going to be a complete solution. But there are elements within this infrastructure that actually answer the question in a new and different way. And if regulators, policymakers in the room can understand that concept, it will offer them, in addition to laws, rules, regulations, contracts, all the other tools that we've had for years, for decades, for centuries, it will offer them a new set of tools that they could perhaps use in addition to everything else that they have to regulate the sphere.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks. We can go over to Nandan. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, and it's great to be on this panel with all of you. I thought I'll set some historical context for what Rahul is saying. Rahul actually is the person who sensitized me to the need for a data privacy law. And that's how we began the journey, 12 years back when I wrote to the Prime Minister saying, as we do Aadhaar, we also need a data privacy law. But I think Rahul is really the leader or the doyen of a whole generation of lawyers in India who are equally well-versed in technology. And I think that's very important because if you just have lawyers who know law but not technology, and you just have technologists who know technology but not law, then you can't get it right. So Rahul and then many others who succeeded him have become they're very good lawyers, but they also understand technology as well as anybody else. And I think that's been a unique differentiator in India. The second thing is that the Aadhaar case, which was in the Supreme Court, also honed the talents of all these lawyer technologists, because the Aadhaar case was the second longest running case in the history of the Indian Supreme Court. And it raised very fundamental issues, even to whether Indians have a fundamental right to privacy. And then the Supreme Court set up a 9-judge bench and came out with a brilliant judgment on that, yes, that Indians have a fundamental right to privacy, but there are certain situations where the state can circumscribe that for public purpose. So I think that and then the Aadhaar law was upheld to say that it met these principles. But I think this combination of this fundamental right discussion and the Aadhaar law, which took about 9 years or something, essentially was fought on both sides by the best lawyers in India. And I think they had to hone their arguments on where does technology end, where does regulation start, what is privacy, can you circumscribe privacy. So I think a whole generation of Indian lawyers learned in the real world how to do this. And then thirdly, I think, Rahul is a practicing lawyer. He's not a lawyer sitting in a think tank or being an activist somewhere. He's a practicing lawyer. So he also understands that in the real world, you have to figure out how to make laws work. So this combination of legal knowledge, technical knowledge, technology knowledge, and practical knowledge actually has laid the foundation of the book and what he's saying. And I think the fact that in India, thanks to people like Rahul, we have figured out how to get the balance right between technology and innovation, between regulation and innovation, and how do you do regulation concurrent with the technology, which is a big question we're facing now in the AI world, right? In the AI world, we are trying very hard to make sure that we don't stifle innovation. At the same time, we want to make sure that it doesn't run away and do some unintended consequences. So this lesson is applying all the time. And I think, therefore, the question of embedding regulation as code, which I think is a brilliant idea, which is that if we can put the regulation in the code, then that will enforce it rather than waiting for the legal system to do that. And now that philosophy of embedding regulation in code, which was initially done in the DEPA architecture, the data empowerment architecture, is now being done in like ONDC and all that, where the regulation is in the code. And I think this is the way to tackle the fast-moving pace of change in innovation with the guardrails that everybody now understands is required. So I think this book is a very important book, not only for India, but for the world, to understand how best to strike this fine balance between regulation and innovation.
Thank you very much. If we can get to Tino, it's a pleasure to moderate a panel with you. Please give us your opening remarks.
Jane, it's always a pleasure to be on a panel with you. And thank you, Rahul, for a really great book. I can't say I've read the whole thing, but I've read about 2/3. And I can tell you, for a lawyer, it's a really interesting book. It's almost a page turner, not quite, maybe. But it's informative. And I mean, there's a way in which the title is ironic, because Larry Lessig wrote this great book about showing that a lawyer could actually understand computing and could take seriously not only the code that we have in the East Coast of the US, which is like, the lawyer code, but in the West Coast. And so the first way in my mind is the computer programmer who understands just the digital code. The second way is the lawyer who understands the legal code, but you're the third way because you understand both. I like that. I'm supportive of the basic message, which is that the world should wake up to the fact that many problems involving economic prosperity and civic life can be addressed with a big effort, to make digital services available to very large numbers of people. I'm also supportive of the idea that something interesting has happened in India that has maybe some analogs or parallels, for example, South Korea, but is distinctive because no jurisdiction has done what India has done at scale. That first layer that effectively provides over 1 billion people with an identity and makes the possibility of digital financial life a reality for them has not happened, to my mind, anywhere else in the world. That said, as a good lawyer, I will argue a little bit with one piece of the story that we are beginning to tell, and I'm very happy, by the way, that Carnegie is part of these discussions, around what digital public infrastructure means. And I'll just make the point a little bit by borrowing a page from Larry Lessig, because before he was writing about code is law, he was writing about social norms and about the extent to which law was in some ways a complement, but also a substitute for the things that we might agree to do on our own without the law telling us to do it, to be nice to each other on this panel, for example. And picking up that insight, I would say, it feels to me you can disaggregate what we seem to mean by digital public infrastructure in India into 3 different things. There is the norm that having a digital identity is a good thing, and the government should push people to do that. There is the regulatory approach to make that a reality and pull the private sector in, but to give it a lane and not let it control everything. And then there's the actual governmental money and organizational capability and people that make it a reality. And I would say in the US, we have a form of digital public infrastructure in particular sectors, and I'll give you 2 examples. So in the context of healthcare, we went through a big fight in the US about whether to create a new system to get more people insurance, Obamacare. That then led to a process of building up digital public infrastructure to get people registered, to get them information about health plans, to make that process easy. Now, we had a hard time getting that off the ground. We could learn a little bit from India. But one reason we had trouble getting that off the ground is because we do not have the norm that it is a good thing for the government to push people to have a digital identity. On the regulation side, I'll give you another example. We have a kind of public infrastructure which is the electric utility sector in the US, and that is so heavily regulated that it almost doesn't matter whether it's outright owned by the government or not, because it's subject to so many rules about what price you can charge, how electric lines should operate, where they should operate, and so on, that it's like a kind of public infrastructure. So all that is to say that I think what's interesting in India is not that you have digital public infrastructure, but that it has a particular meaning based on what you use as leverage here. And in particular, I would note that for many societies, the US being one, the real fight is not just how can you solve the technical problem, it's how do you build enough trust in the government, given a long history of founding a country on the basis of distrust of government, to say, yeah, I'll stand up and I'll let the government give me a digital ID. And I'll end with this point. Just one example of how even the national security imperative runs into that fight. After 9/11, we realized in the US that we had a problem because there was so much variation in how people were identified, driver's licenses in different states without very little actual quality of documents and so on for the most part, that we pushed for the idea that an ID should be a real ID, should actually be subject to the kinds of checks that in India have been built into the DPI. We have been waiting for 20 years for that to be implemented because pretty much every time the deadline comes, the deadline gets extended. It's that controversial an issue, and that's even following the terrorist attacks. I don't think that means we can't do better on digital public infrastructure in the US, but it does highlight, to go back to Larry Lessig, that the first fight is about what norms are appropriate and then the technology follows.
Thank you, Tino. Thank you, Nandan, and of course, Rahul. I want to pick up the next section on asking a question that, especially Tino, I think you've alluded to it, that a lot of countries have some type of digital public infrastructure. The concept that India has, however, is different, and I think what your book has done a great job is starting to unpack that concept for us with some of the unique features of India's DPI, and it's what you call the Techno-legal governance framework. I would want to take another minute just to explain that, because I think this is where we're beginning to see the unique perspective of India and how you're surfacing it to the world as a unique offering for those who are interested in the DPI and, of course, the AI and any other technology journey.
So, so look, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think DPI is, in a sense, the language of this thing that we're doing in Africa and around the world was given a name by India in this last year, but we all do it. And in the course of the G20 and in the course of many other conversations, bilaterally as well, I found that actually the real effort was to explain to people that this is what it is, and then to have them in their countries discover that, yes, this has a parallel. This is something that we're doing. I think the next lift was to say that right now you're thinking about regulating this space through laws. And of course you must continue to do that. But embedded within this are ways in which you can actually also regulate it through code and through the infrastructure. Now, that is the underlying thesis behind this idea of techno-legal governance. Nandan was very kind to articulate some of the capacity requirements. You need to have regulators who understand technology. You also need to have technologists who need to spend some time understanding regulatory and policy imperatives. But I think there is no way to do this other than with this sort of a working arrangement between regulators, policymakers, and quite frankly, between a huge variety of different stakeholders that bring their own perspectives into the conversation. If we're going to regulate the medical space, we can't do it without having actual practicing doctors in the space. It's pointless to do it because you will bring your perspective, which a lot of the EMR, EHR regulations in the US, I'm saying the US because that's where it started, were written from the perspective of insurance companies and lawyers, because what were they looking to do? How are we going to build this? And what is the liability we have to protect? That's not serving the medical requirements of the patient that actually needs to get this information. And so they're not storing information which is valuable to the doctor. What are the allergies that you have? What's the medications that you're on? That's not captured in an EMR. Now, if we could bring a set of stakeholders to the room, understand what technology can do, we will have a better way to regulate this. So, I think the phrase is techno-legal because I think that's the basic two people we need to have in the room to have this conversation. We need the technologists because we're talking about a digital framework, and we need the lawyers because we're looking at policy frameworks. But I think we must go beyond that, and we must get all the stakeholders that are necessary for a given sector into the room in order to develop a governance framework that will actually work for the sector.
Thank you very much. And I also have to say you need the economists, just because I'm one. Thank you. I think the intersection of technology and the legal aspect cannot be overstated. So that is really important. And it goes to my next question that goes to you, Nandan. Yesterday, you initiated the conversation that we have to start looking at DPA as a consumable component and unpacking it to other countries. So is this the techno-legal governance? How do you see that as a consumable to other countries?
No, I think that's a great question, Jane, and I think absolutely, I think if the concept of DPI in the way that it's been done in India is to be globally used, we have to make the techno-legal part of it also part of the offering of what needs to be done. And I think this book actually sets the stage for that. I think in India, of course, we have been fortuitous because all the players came together, right? Technologists came, the lawyers came, the economists also were there somewhere. And I think also the government and the regulators, I'll give you an example of the central bank, the Reserve Bank of India, and they have always been at the forefront of embracing technology, or SEBI, which is our market regulator, or TRAI, which is a telecom regulator. So these are regulators who have embraced technology and brought in the regulatory need for safe markets or safe lending, but with an open mind towards technology. So having the regulators and the government also on board is very important. So I think part of the challenge we'll have when we take this global is how do we recreate these alliances in the countries where we go, because we have to get all these players together. And I think going back to Tino's point about norms, I think the one thing that's now, I think, beginning to work for us is people are realizing that if they really want to get to their economic, social, and climate goals, if they want to raise growth rates, if they want society to be more inclusive, if they want to go from being an informal society to a formal society, if they want to get to climate change in a proper way, it has to have underlying digital infrastructure to make that happen. And therefore, it's no longer a choice or a luxury that you need. It's essential to get to where we want, right? And there are many, many examples of that. For example, in climate, if you want to ensure that people get the benefits, suppose there's a climate crisis and you have to give emergency funding to people, where is the pipe to send that money to them? Or if you want to have climate resilience and you want adaptation of homes near the coast so that they don't get overrun by the sea, how do you make sure we get the money to them? So when you get into the actual challenges that societies are facing now and in the future, you realize that unless you have an underlying way of thinking of the digital rails to make this happen, it won't be fit for purpose. And therefore, I think once you start getting there, then I think we can also deal with the challenges of the norms. Because ultimately, life is about trade-offs, all right? We have found that people are willing to give up the privacy for fairly trivial benefits. So that means that if we can create the right value proposition, and if we can get the benefits out, then they will make the necessary compromises on what they want. So I think this is the book and the larger approach of techno-legal governance is an integral part of the DPI making it consumable for the world.
That's a great answer. Thank you. I want to pick up on that concept of norms that Tino brought up, and also on the work that you've been doing on AI. Can we start relating the techno-legal, this new techno-legal governance framework also into the AI conversation? Do you foresee that as also a possibility?
I think it's a requirement, and a good example of that is several reasons why, but one, just right off the top of my head, is however good any government is individually in coming up with the right tests for a model, the right baselines for what minimum standards of safety the model should have, I certainly don't want to live in a world where the companies, the private sector, or the general public don't look to raise those safety standards even more without diminishing functionality. So that, to my mind, runs through a techno-legal approach, right? It means that the companies have to find a way to turn ideas about guardrails into code and into training runs for models that go beyond whatever the government has required. But I want to make also a more general point about the techno-legal approach that applies to AI and to just core DPI. And that is, it might be helpful to distinguish between two different kinds of solutions to the trust problem. Because even in a country like India, to my mind, where there's maybe a little bit less reluctance to have the government play a catalyzing role in building up a national identity system, there were still questions of trust, some of them more legal, some of them more political, and those were largely overcome. So one piece of that, which is on the more techno side of the techno-legal, is the code is law approach, to literally say, there are these controls to who can access certain information, what databases are permitted for people with certain credentials, these kinds of audit trails that are available, this kind of AI that actually looks for different patterns of use of information so we can detect whether a government official or a private sector person or a hacker has tried to use information inappropriately. I want to emphasize that that is almost never going to be enough. That another aspect of the norms piece, which gets more to the legal side of techno-legal, is what level of trust a society has that its leaders are not going to find a way around that or a way to diminish that or to dilute that or to get a result from the information infrastructure showing that there's been a breach and to sweep it under the rug. And that's trickier because it goes to how do you deal with this gap in information between whatever the public can actually observe and what people in power actually have. So to my mind, to the extent that that has been increasingly addressed in India, it still leaves on the table the question of how, if one wants to promote this approach abroad, there's going to be a way of validating that. And are those problems primarily going to be resting on individual countries, or might there be some international approach to try to create that trust?
Thank you, Tino. And I think you've brought up a whole new area, I think, of conversation is how the multi-stakeholder engagement also has to be in this and how much is going to be embraced within those forums. And I think India has been such a great example of pushing this even through the G20 and other global organizations. So, and my next question before I go to the audience is, I think I'll just open it to the floor. Have you thought about that? Have you thought about the approach that this is best used, not just for the Indian case, but also for other global stages and countries?
So, I mean, of course, and I think, as I said, the conversation started last year at GTS around what are we going to do with DPI for the upcoming G20. We can see that we did I would say, fairly good job, to put it mildly, with getting awareness of the DPI concept through the G20s, the grand stage that the G20 offered us. But I think, this is more than just the technology that we offer. I think as we did the conversations, a couple of things became very obvious. This is not just an India story. India did the work of putting it on the stage and giving it a name, but this work was being done by countries around the world. And the more we sort of dug, we found that there were more and unique evidences of digital public infrastructure in countries we didn't even expect. So I think the effort of doing a multi-stakeholder approach is not as onerous as it seems, because this is already things that people have figured out has to be done and are doing. I think the work at the multi-stakeholder organizations, and we just finished a very nice roundtable around the Quad countries, just exploring that multi-stakeholder group to see what can happen there. And I think there's something that we need to do, some effort we need to do around a common language. India came up with the language of DPI, but there's more that we need to do as far as language is concerned. And I think allied with that, just to pick up on Tino's idea of norms, is we need to attach a set of values. Because anyone can do digitization, and you can do digitization with a certain set of values and with another set of not so good values. And we know where this will end up. And so I think the benefit of a multi-stakeholder approach to the idea of DPI would be to articulate a common language that we all know what it takes to build a DPI that is, and then the second part, aligned with a set of values that this multi-stakeholder organization stands for. And I think that's the effort that we really need to engage in right now. I mean, I agree, Tino, that not everyone would do biometric identity. And the point is that not everyone needs to. It's not a prerequisite of DPI that we have to start with identity. It is what India started with. But there are many other applications of DPI, as Nandan says, G2P payments in the time of a crisis. And all of these, the DPI approach offers you tools that will allow you to achieve it. If you have an identity, we'll plug onto it. If you don't have an identity, we'll find another way to sort of deliver this within the framework. But I think the real important thing is getting a common language and getting a common set of values. Because with these two, I think we can see this proliferate.
Do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, so I think you did raise a very important point, is that one of the things we have been talking about is how to make DPI as a service, how to make it very simple to use, rapid adoption, otherwise, and so that we focus on the real issues and not on these operational issues. And I think in that context, perhaps investing more in what is the techno-legal approach and how it can be packaged in a consumable way for other countries, I think is a valid point which we need to spend more time on.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Tina. We have about 10 minutes, so I want to open this Whoa, a lot of hands. There's some microphones. I think they've been put. If you can make your way to the nearest microphone. Oh, they're going round. I see someone. Okay, some there. Sorry. Go ahead. Then we can start with Immaculate Kasait, who is the Data Protection Commissioner for Kenya. So thank you for beginning the questions.
Thank you, Jane, and for the panelists, especially Rahul, and also Nandan, because the Office of the Data Commissioner in Kenya exists because of the attempt by Kenya to put in place a digital public infrastructure. And interestingly, one of the issue argued in court was that because of what really happened. Just a reflection, because I think that is what Marion has spoken about. How do we navigate trust? Because I think for us, where I come from, that's the bigger issue. And to an extent, it has paralyzed the country. Every time there's an attempt to put in place a digital the digital infrastructure, we are back in court discussing elements of law, but really it's an issue of trust. And completely unable to see the bigger picture of how it's likely to help the country. And looking at the our legal loopholes, they haven't done a data protection impact assessment. It is not adequate. Just your thoughts in terms of then, as you export this great idea to other countries, how do we navigate that very fundamental issue? Thank you.
Perhaps we take this question and then we can go back to the floor.
Just very briefly, I think the core issue has two components to my mind. One is that there be some maybe international standards and some assistance in trying to figure out the best technical mechanisms to limit breaches, both, external hackers, but also efforts by people in power to breach the safeguards. I think that is not meaningless. That's a starting point. But then beyond that, there has to be perhaps some building of trust over time. So perhaps focusing on a particular sector, whether it's travel or education or financial activity, and then expanding as that trust builds up. But I think that's not a small problem, and we ought not to sweep it under the rug. I think in some ways, there's the more government effectively delivers services, the more it can build trust. But in order for that to happen, there needs to be enough trust to sort of enable the creation of the infrastructure.
Okay. Thank you. Rahul, do you want to weigh in on the question also?
No, and I think that's absolutely correct. I think, what we're hoping is digital public infrastructure with adoption with enough countries will actually in itself start to generate trust. That, there is infrastructure that has worked at scale in a number of similar countries. But of course, it has to happen. It can't just be India waving the flag saying we've done it. We need more countries to say that.
Yes, Nandan.
Also, I think, of course, trust between people and the state varies across the world. And it varies from a lot of trust, in which case they're willing to do a lot of things, and no trust, in which case not willing to accept. So I think the one way to think about this perhaps is, that as Rahul also said, there are many, many, many types of digital public infrastructure which can, make a difference to the lives of people. And many of them are not as contentious as ones that where the state comes in. So one possible approach could be to bring in those DPIs, which are relatively easier to implement or to be acceptable, demonstrate value, and then create a climate of opinion that more DPIs are required. So I think I would do it by some approach like that.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure there are many user case examples because of Aadhaar in that, so I really appreciate that answer. I think what we'll do is maybe take 2-3 questions in the next round so we can answer them together. I'll start with the gentleman who is standing by the microphone. Introduce yourself and please go straight to your question.
Hello, this is Deep Shekhar from Money Control. My question is to both Mr. Matthan and Mr. Nilekani. With AI coming and generative AI, where models are trained on users' data, on people's data, I think AI will become a part of this digital governance architecture over the next few years. What do you think about training of data on normal people's data, training of models on people's data, and also on artists' data, creators, musicians, writers? So how do you think this would fit into our digital governance architecture going forward, or how it should? because I think the DPDP does not address it as yet. So both how you think about it and how Mr. Nilekani think about it.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, let's get at least two, if you don't mind. I had seen another hand here, then we can answer those.
Thank you. My name is Yogendra Kumar. I just have, in respect of the DPI in India, now the issue, of course, is that, the way it is spreading at the moment, the question is of leakage. And even in banking sector, every day you read about cyber fraud and that sort of thing. So unless you have some enforcement mechanism which is actually effective and visible, I think the credibility would be a major issue. I think that's something that one actually needs. And of course now, BharatNet is just about 1/6 of the villages that the government wants to cover. So as it spreads all over with artificial intelligence coming in and so on and so forth, I think the credibility of this infrastructure actually I think is something, both in terms of enforcement, is something I think we'll all have to think very seriously about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can first cover those questions, and then we'll still have time for any more. Thank you.
Maybe I'll take the AI question from the AI perspective, and maybe Nandan will take the other one. But look, unfortunately with AI, the genie is already out of the bottle. So AI has already trained itself on hundreds and thousands of artists' information. And those are now embedded into models. And so trying to pull that back out of the model and put it into a regulated space may be difficult. So I like the fact that you asked the question going forward. So going forward is certainly something that we can think about. And I think a lot of AI companies are actually implementing frameworks in which they're saying that we will ensure one of two things. One is that you have the ability to pull your images or your creative contributions out of our data sets, or just very simply say that you should not run your data sets on our creative works. And they're offering computational guarantees that that is in fact the case. Or they're saying that we will put in place mechanisms whereby we will do some sort of a revenue share with you if we have done that to ensure that you make some sort of revenue out of it. Both of these, as Tino says, are impossible without some sort of code-based enforcement, because these things are taking place at a scale that is impossible to regulate solely through law. Or we can attempt to do it, but we're just absolutely out of the gate going to fail. And so I think the idea of building into the AI infrastructures this sort of a mechanism that would either have the ability to pull protected intellectual property out of the training cycle, or if they are in the training cycle, to identify them and do some sort of a revenue share model is an ideal candidate for law as code in the modern world and going forward.
Okay. Thank you. Nandan?
Yeah, I think in the AI world, it's all the more important to do all the things required in a way that you combine technology and law. I think one of the things that's going to happen is that we're going to see wide variety of regulations from around the world. And you're going to have regulations that are quite supportive of innovation. You're going to find regulations that are very rigorous about putting constraints on AI models. And that's going to vary from country to country based upon their norms and trust and so on. So I think there also you can put that into code and actually put in automation to make sure that the AI that is being built meets the regulatory needs of different jurisdictions. So I think there's a lot of that. Specifically on the issue of, I think going forward on training these models, I think definitely copyright violations and all that need to be looked at in a much bigger way. On the fraud thing, I think definitely, I think if there is fraud, then that reduces credibility. I think related to the size of the financial system, the fraud is, I think, not so high. But I think our regulators are seized with this to see how to reduce fraud even further, because that's very important to create a vibrant financial system.
Okay, fantastic. Tina would ask you to weigh in, at least on the AI question. I know that's your area.
Just very briefly, I think I agree with what was just said, and I would simply add that to me, the intersection of DPI and AI is less about how the data from the DPI process is used to train models and more about how those data are used in effectively the context window, for example, a generative model, to target much more specifically the outputs of a model to the person involved. That is, so that's a version, of course, of what search engines already do, but with a degree of precision and persuasive power that raises interesting questions. And I think it's a subject of interesting public deliberation in a democracy, how much we want government to do that versus to forego the opportunity to use an AI model to target a communication more specifically and simply treat every person the same way.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, our time is up, and I won't be able to take another round of questions, but I know all the panelists are attending the GTS. I would encourage you to reach out to them if you have any further questions. Let's go to what we call the lightning round. And I'll start with Tino, if you can give us at least 30 seconds of your closing remarks on the third way and on the techno-legal approach.
I mean, I'm just going to say, I think that the tenor of this conversation is probably, look, there are complexities here, there are challenges, there are going to be some barriers to adoption in other countries that have a lot to do with trust, but fundamentally, opportunities to lift people out of poverty run through the use of digital infrastructure, and we all in this room have a responsibility to think creatively about how to leverage that, and the Indian example is a really interesting one. That's point one. I would note a second point, though, that I hope we'll all think about, which is relevant also to the history of the internet, and that is, in the early days of the internet, it was a curiosity. Then it became a mild convenience, and now it's something closer to a necessity, and it's hard for us to imagine what the world would look like if we had to forego the internet for a week, how that would affect our lives, our finance, our critical infrastructure. And it's worth noting that the upside of a version of digital public infrastructure can be profound, but after a while, to the extent that it becomes embedded as a real requirement for transacting, then the risk on the cybersecurity side is not just about privacy, it's about the potentially really devastating effects of weakening that even for a day or two, and I think that's worth considering as well.
Thank you for those excellent points. Nandan?
I think what Rahul has addressed is that in a fast-moving world of technological change, what is the best strategy to let regulators regulate and innovators innovate? I think that's the fundamental message of his book.
I like that. Let regulators regulate and innovators innovate. You have to top that.
I can't top that. I'm just going to say that it was my line that Nandan presented really well. but I
It's the
just
title for your next book, by the way.
And please tell us how you can get this wonderful book. I've read it. It's a wonderful read, easy read. So please also let us know in your closing remarks how we can get the book.
Yeah, look, I mean, this book has a bunch of ideas, maybe a little controversial, maybe a little provocative, but I do hope that you will engage with the ideas, provocative or not. If you don't agree with them, I would really love to hear from you, because that's sort of the idea of putting it out there. The book is obviously available on Amazon everywhere, but I hope that my publisher has they've sent them already? Okay, so it's available outside. So, look, buy it to engage with the ideas, and please feel free to reach out to me. I would love to have longer conversations. And thank you all so much for doing this, and thank you all for listening.
All right. Thank you so much, and also thank you to Carnegie India for hosting this. Thank you very much.